Wonder Woman comes out June 2nd, 2017. That means there's still time to get that kind of amazing looking body. Women's workload training. And as if by fate, the letters and logos even match. Must be destiny. So here are the 3 ancient Amazonian rules of women's workload training, passed on by Hippolyta. Firstly, ask yourself which pattern today, bend, squat or lunge. Second, ask yourself 2 foot, 1 foot or split stance. Now this is going to be a neural issue. Thirdly, ask yourself, do you want to load it? And then, where do you want to carry it? Now that's going to be a strength issue. Answer these 3 questions and you've got the exercise. And the exercise you choose is either the medicine to correct imbalance or the tonic to maintain it. Quickly, let's start with the patterns. Bend, squat, lunge. They increase in order of complexity, but if you've got all of the patterns licked, then I think the order is bend, lunge, squat, lunge. But if you're starting off, then the first goal is to tame that beast that is bend. And that's what the hip series is all about. I will get back to it, don't worry, it's all in an interconnected universe. Hip hinge is your college degree. Once you've passed your hip exam, then you're just going down the body, adding the knee and ankle control. You're studying for your masters in squat patterning. Once squat patterning is learned on 2 legs, you're then looking at a split stance doctorate, aka the lunge. Then you progress to 1 leg, bend, squat, lunge, and now you're rising to the rank ahead of department. Finally, you're moving in these 1 foot positions, alternating, which is essentially exaggerated gait. That's, university dean. And that's the pattern progression to make you a hip academic. You're back on the tonic, the gin and tonics. And here's the reason. The bend and squat are both hip flexion and hip extension patterns. To maintain good spinal control, you need full range of movement in the hip flexor complex. To keep that hip flexor complex healthy, you need to follow it up with hip hyperextension, which is the lunge. Now, when you actually choose to do the lunge after the bend is your business. It might be 10 minutes later, the next day, next week. You choose. But here's the benefit. People talk about tightness in the hips, and most people struggle for range of movement in the squat and the deadlift. You know that bad form of lifting with the back and getting no depth with the hips because the hips don't work properly because they're too tight? That's a vicious cycle. Tight hips equal reduced range. So you're rooting around elsewhere to try and get the range, normally from your back, and this is all because your hip flexion to hip extension to hip hyperextension is just all out of whack. Basically, your deadlift to squat to lunge ratio is just all jacked up. Going bend, lunge, squat, lunge keeps the ratios closer and the hips looser. This means more range, which means more activation at less weight, which then means more muscle growth at less weight, which then means more muscle growth at more weight. That's like a Dyson cyclone of gains. Now let's look at the patterns, and yeah, you guessed it, they all exist on a spectrum. I need like a sound effect every time I say spectrum. The bend is the simplest and in its purest form is always a posterior chain exercise. The hip hinges, the glutes go back, but the spectrum goes from this to this. But once you start moving those knees forward, which is fine, you're starting the enrollment process in the squat patterning. But that's just a conscious choice, it's a variable. Then over time you get deeper and deeper with the knee bend and then ultimately the ankle bend too. Eventually, you're doing the squat patterning, and that exists on a spectrum. Now, it can be a predominantly posterior affair. Hip hinges, glutes go back, knees bend. Or you can get your anterior action on with more ankle flexion, or again, just break at the knee and stay more upright. You might recognize these as high bar back squats, goblet squats, or front squats. But the real difference between these is where you're carrying the weight just influences the timing of your hip and knee break. The more upright you want to be, the more you have to break at the knee first. The more lean that you generate in the lift, the more you've got to break at the hips. Or more simple, where you carry the weight and which joint you decide to move first affects which area gets loaded the most. The squat exercise progression is a pretty deep topic. I don't actually think that there's any right or wrong order when you're learning it. But personally, I say that if you've mastered the bend, which is hip break, then move to the squat pattern with what you already know, which is hip break, and then add knee and ankle flexion coordination. That's probably your easiest first step. And that will be called low bar back squat. And then you just gradually practice a squat pattern, moving the bar up the back, across the shoulders and to the front of the body, so that you're teaching yourself bit by bit to learn more upright posture and breaking at the knee first. But that's just me. But essentially you're just drifting along the spectrum. I don't really subscribe to this notion of, right, I'm doing this exercise and I'm going to do it this way always. I mean, firstly, it depends on your personal levers, but your personal range and what you're trying to achieve with it is going to change over time. As long as it has those features, it doesn't really matter where you're carrying the weight or even the depth that you reach, as long as it has the features of a squat. It seems like people think of each of the exercises as being very different things. They aren't. They're just variations on the spectrum of the patterns, and all the patterns are linked. The lunge is the same as a squat pattern. You're just crossing the horizontal line. You can make the lunge more hip dominant by breaking at the hip first, or you can make it more knee dominant by breaking at the knee first. The lunge spectrum is basically just giving you more options in regards to distance between the front foot and the back foot and the left and right foot. And the variation is pretty useful because remember, if you're in balance, you're going to be doing the lunge pattern twice every pattern cycle. And for anyone listening who hears lunge and then runs for the hills, here's a thought. I think people's knees hurt in the lunge because they haven't mastered the anterior end of the squat spectrum. Without getting that right, they jump straight across to the lunge, break at the knee, and put all the weight through the forefoot. So by Zeus, how do you apply all this? Well, here's an example. Okay, so imagine if your knees hurt from lunging the day before, but you know you want to do bend. So you just know not to do any knee travel. So you stay up at this end of the bend spectrum. Whereas if you were learning patterns because you were new to this, and you felt that the bend was your comfort zone right now, but you wanted to walk a little bit on the wild side with the squat pattern one day, then this is what you might say. Right, I play to my strengths, and bend is my strength, but rather than just having my hips travel backwards today, I'm going to add a little fragrance with some knee travel. Just a dab, see how it feels. That way you're gradually introducing yourself to the squat patterning while still staying true and reinforcing good bend patterning. And if you're thinking, this all sounds entirely different from anything I've ever heard before, Amazons, they lived on a secret island, far from the influence of man. What am I going to tell you? You know there's going to be a part 5 because I think I've only dealt with like the top one, so look out for that. In the meantime, ask your questions in the comments bay. If the reply's too complicated, I'll just, I don't know, write it up as part 8 or something I think I'm up to. Anyway, hit the thumbs up. If you like my vibe, please subscribe. Woo! Woo!